To my fellow councillors, and it's the four of us who will be making the decisions tonight. I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Councillor Benton.
Hi, I'm Councillor Toby James Benton from Colville Ward.
Councillor Will Lane from Queensgate Ward.
Good evening, Councillor Lloyd North from Camden Ward.
Thanks very much. And to my left is the officer team, who tonight is led by Lisa Chung. The officers will be presenting the cases and providing us advice where needed. I'll start with apologies. We have one apology for absence from Councillor Oretti, who's unfortunately unwell, and that's the only apology. Declarations of interest, councillors.
Yes, on case item number 4, 5658 Hornton Street, I should declare that I have met with the owners and I have seen the inside of the property. But I'm free to make an open decision this evening, so I'm happy to carry on.
Thank you, Councillor Norton. I know you've discussed that with officers. So it's not unusual that you know, being the small borough that we are, that we may have seen properties before, but the important thing is we're able to make a fair decision and come into it with an open mind. Minutes, colleagues, minutes were circulated ahead of the meeting. Is everyone happy for me to go ahead and sign the minutes of the previous meeting? Yeah. Okay. Right, now, before we start, it's probably helpful if I run through the order in which we'll be hearing the cases this evening. So the first case will be 14 Lower Addison Gardens. The second case will be 103 Elgin Crescent. Third case is 51 Cathcart Road. The fourth case is 56 to 58 Hornton Street. The fifth case is 1 to 17 Waynflete Square and the associated properties on Shellfleet Drive. Sorry. And then the sixth case is 13 Gunter Grove, and the final case is 23 Finstock Road. Just a couple of pieces of housekeeping before we start. Unfortunately, the cameras aren't working this evening, so for those of you who have large TV audiences back home, I'm afraid they won't see you, but the audio is working and the slides are working, so the case still will be recorded and broadcast on YouTube in that sense, but we just don't have any video this evening. If I could remind anyone speaking, and I sometimes forget this time to time, you press the button in front of you to speak, and when you finish speaking, press it again to turn off. And it's important you do that, otherwise we can't hear, you know, we pick up sound and we can't hear the other speakers properly. So please remember to turn off your microphone when you're done speaking. In terms of the amount of speaking time, I'll remind you on each individual case, but broadly speaking, people get 3 minutes to speak, and that's shared if you're speaking together. For example, if there are two objectors speaking, and we have to be quite strict about that for procedural reasons. So I will sort of put my hand up when you are done with your time, and if you can just wrap up within the next 10 seconds, that would be really helpful. Otherwise, I have to cut you off, and I look really rude, and I'd rather not do that. I think that's it from a procedural point of view, in which case we proceed to the first case, which is 14 Lower Addison Gardens.
Thank you, Chairman. This application, it's the second application in the North Pack that you have there in front of you. And planning permission is sought for conversion into 3 self-contained units, together with a Mansard roof and alterations to the rear, including a rear extension and terrace. First of all, I'll just show you some contextual images, so that these aren't the application property, but these are other properties in Upper Addison Gardens. And you can see there, for example, in that first photograph, that there are already infill extensions and projecting balconies as a number of other properties. There it's number 28 and number 29. But you can see immediately that the rear elevations have been altered sort of quite considerably since their original form. And then sort of a little bit closer actually to the application property, that's number 6 on the left and number 8, and you can see there again there's a mixture and a variation of balconies and railings and infill extensions. So as always, the context for a planning application is key to its assessment, and you'll see that reflected in the reports. Finally, just a bit more context, that's numbers 29, 30 and 31, and again the sort of familiar pattern of infill extensions and balcony railings and so forth. Turning to the application property, that's a series of floor plans for the existing building, and the next image will be the proposal. So the existing that you have there, you can see that, that there's a terrace at the raised ground floor level, and you can see that that's infilled and then moved up one story basically. So that the terrace now appears over in this image, whereas in the one before, the terrace is there. So basically there's an infill extension, the terrace moves up one level. And on the right-hand side, you can see the floor plan for the Mansard story. And those are the existing elevations, the front elevation on the left and the rear elevation on the right. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the existing terrace that in the proposed one gets infilled with a set of doors and Juliet balcony, and then the railings and the terrace move up one level. And at the roof level, you can see the existing roof slopes changed into mansard slopes. This is one of the few remaining properties in the group that actually doesn't have a mansard. So this is bringing it into line effectively at roof level with other properties. And then in section, that's the proposed section, and you can see the mansard story at the top of the image. And then just a perspective image, just so you can sort of understand how the mansard relates to the rest of the building. And that's the last slide, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. So we have Councillor Knight joining us, who's going to speak on behalf of the objectors. Councillor Knight, you have 3 minutes, and you can start whenever you're ready.
I'm here today to set out the objections to the 14 Lower Allison Gardens planning application on behalf of the residents who feel very strongly about the proposed development and change the back facade, which would feature multiple balconies that would not be in keeping with the other houses and residents feel this threatens their area's architectural heritage given the property's visibility from the communal gardens behind. I want to start by saying that when the letters were sent out to residents informing them of this application of the 28 that were sent, there were 20 objections and no letters of support. I must stress the residents fully support the desire to upgrade this property. However, they feel strongly that this should be done with a design that is sympathetic to the adjoining properties and is appropriate with the context of the terrace, where it is a highly visible centre property in their shared communal garden. They have supported previous planning proposals submitted for this property by the prior developers, who had consulted them to achieve successful plans for alterations which respected the surrounding properties and its historical heritage. In stark contrast, the new application proposes a brute stacked block of flats on a communal garden side of the building with an overabundance of iron railings and new balconies, wholly out of context with the properties it adjoins. Even more alarmingly, it involves the complete destruction of the exceptional Victorian architectural legacy provided in the original existing design. We know that renewing the legacy and the overall quality of our built environment is a priority for the Council. Delivering a livable borough, which refers to our preservation of the historic township, is also a key plank of the vision of the borough's emerging new local plan. The current local plan sets out at policy CL3 that development must preserve or enhance the character of the appearance of the conservation area. Residents' objections make plain that they do not think the application enhances the appearance of the area, and the recent Holland Park Conservation Area Appraisal Report confirms this, expressing concern that erosion on the street's unique architectural features and that Lower Allison Gardens has lost a great deal of detail due to the harmful alterations, and reinstatement of the original designs to all these features where lost would be a great enhancement to the character of the conservation area. So I strongly urge the committee tonight to consider the key responsibilities to protect the integrity and historic context of the existing architectural legacy of this iconic conservation area, and in particular to consider policies CL 3, 6, 9 and 11, which I believe this application clearly flouts. In the planning officer's report, whilst acknowledging the validity of the objections submitted, each one citing the jarring aesthetics of the rear elevations facing onto the garden, they allege that it cannot be turned down because there are precedents already established elsewhere on the garden. However, the property, which has already been altered, is towards the end of the terrace and is much less visible from the communal garden. I also want to stress that just because poor planning decisions have been made in the past, there should not be a reason for them to be repeated again. If such decisions continue to be approved, we will risk damaging the overall architectural detail and heritage of this area and making a mockery of our own policies, which will be a great shame. I urge you to reject this application this evening and encourage the applicant to work more proactively with residents surrounding the property so they can resubmit the proposal that respects and conserves the original character and architecture of the property and enhances the surrounding area.
Thank you very much, Councillor Knight. So we have no one speaking this evening on behalf of the applicant. So we move straight to questions from the committee. Colleagues, does anyone have any questions for Councillor Knight? Yes, Councillor North.
Hello, good evening, Councillor Knight. There's a considerable amount of paperwork with this application. I can see there's strong feelings for it or against it. And the question I've got to ask you is, the objectors are not objecting in principle to it being redeveloped. It's just that they want further consultation. So if the committee were minded to reject this application, would your answer from your residents be that you would have further consultation and a revised scheme would be considered?
Yes, absolutely. I think the residents who have come together in Lower Allison Gardens are very proud of where they live and its architecture and preserving that architecture. And I think they were sort of not happy that they weren't involved in the process of the planning, and all they want to do is preserve what they believe are the beautiful architectural aspects of the square. I went there this morning and I can completely understand what they're saying to see it in person for the second time, and yeah, they want to work to preserve that, and they want the property developed. They just want it to respect the architecture around it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question. Am I right in saying that the residents who have objected, their concerns don't really refer to the Mansard? It's really this infill and the loss of the bottle balustrading and the loss of what's 3 houses next to each other in the centre of the gardens that have this, that don't have the infill and have the bottle balustrading currently. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think as the property is so central to the communal garden, and there is still the beautiful balconies that are left. It's preserving what is still there, and yeah, it's very beautiful.
Yeah, and I'll ask officers as well, but I wouldn't expect you to know, but I don't suppose you know whether the bottle balustrading is an original feature or not.
I don't, but I would assume so. I don't know.
That's fine, not to worry. Any other questions for Councillor Knight? Yes, Councillor Lane.
In relation to the bottle balustrading, to your knowledge in their engagement with residents, have the developers given any reasons why they're choosing to replace that with modern railings?
I actually don't know that, but all I know from speaking to the residents is there's been very little communication between the developers and them, and I think that's been the biggest problem, is they could stress a lot of this if
Thank you.
Communication that was opened.
Any other questions, colleagues, for Councillor Knight? No, in which case we move on to the second part of the meeting, which is questions to officers. Does anyone have any questions for officers? I have a couple, but shall I lead off? Mr. Taylor, am I right in saying, so 14, which we're talking about, is it flanked by two properties which currently present in the same way at the rear, in that they have bottle balustrading at the same level on, I suppose, the upper ground floor terrace? Is that correct?
Yes, I think it is, Chairman. The context is that overall, when you sort of look all the way along the terrace, only 4 of the 16 in the terrace as a whole do retain the bottle balustrades. So that, in other words, the majority have lost them. That said, the immediate neighbours, in other words, 12 and 16, they also retain them. So you have this sort of group really at the centre of the terrace that does retain its bottles.
And I noticed in the report it says, let me find the right line, 6.7, it is somewhat regrettable that the existing bottle balustrading currently featured at this location would be removed. I mean, is there, so objectors are saying that even though lots have developed and lost the bottle balustrading, there's 3 in the centre which still have it, and therefore they make a positive contribution by still demonstrating that feature, and therefore couldn't one argue that it is a loss to the conservation area to lose another one?
Well, I think the word regressible is obviously in there in paragraph 6.7 quite deliberately. That the loss of any sort of original or traditional feature is obviously regressible. That said, I mean, as in my introduction, I sort of mentioned that the context for an application is obviously a very important material consideration. And I mean, in this case, if they were listed buildings, for example, even if all the buildings, apart from one, had lost their bottles, there would be a very definite presumption to retain the bottles on that last remaining building. The conservation area context is a little different to that, though. The test is essentially to look at the prevailing character and appearance of not just the building, but also the whole terrace and the conservation area. And the context here is that the majority of the buildings that provide that existing character don't actually have bottle balustrades at the moment. So that's why the report sort of phrases it as it does, which is that it is regressible, but nevertheless it is within the prevailing context.
Colleagues, other questions? Councillor Lane.
Yes, I have a question. It's mentioned in the case summary that 2 new residential dwellings would be created, which would provide a welcome addition to borough housing stock. To what extent was that an overriding consideration? And were all aspects of the application to remain the same but for that conversion into flats? Would your decision have been any different?
Obviously that isn't the proposal before us, but I can answer, I think, with a high degree of certainty, which would be that if there were no residential units provided, no additions to the housing stock provided, my view would be that the recommendation would be exactly as it is before you. Essentially, the assessment of the external alterations and the impact upon the character and appearance of the conservation area, and the test as to whether that character or appearance would be preserved, that assessment would be exactly the same. I mean, the additions to the housing stock are material considerations, but I don't think this is a case where they'd be relied upon in any way to outweigh a harm to the area. I think the assessment really would be the same for the conservation area.
Thank you. And just one more question, if I may. Paragraph 6.16, you say the flats would meet the desired minimum floor space as stated within the London Housing SPD. To what extent are they above that minimum? Is it that they just meet the minimum, or are they significantly larger than the minimum standard for floor space?
I actually don't have the floor space figures to hand, I'm afraid, so I couldn't tell you the degree of access there.
Thank you.
I have one more question regarding privacy. I think some objectors noted that there weren't balconies at that level on the row and facing to the rear, and therefore it would sort of, I think the implication was, I don't have the exact words, but the implication was it would provide sort of new overlooking and I suppose more onto the communal gardens and sort of reduce the privacy. But from what you were showing in the presentation, it looks like there are examples of balconies at that level or higher already on the row. Is that correct?
I think the majority of properties don't have balconies at the higher level. But there is overlooking, obviously, from properties all the way along the terrace. I wouldn't suggest that to put a balcony at the higher level would result in no new overlooking. I think it must do to an extent. The question is the extent of that something that's unprecedented or contrary to policy CL5? That there is an existing terrace lower down and there are plenty of balconies on other properties further along. I think there would be some additional overlooking just by virtue of the fact the angle would be different from the higher balcony. But the railings are set back by 400 millimetres, so that really prevents anyone craning their head over. There would be some additional overlooking, but not such that would be contrary to policy CL5.
That's very helpful, thank you. Colleagues, any more questions? Yes, Councillor North.
Just to re-answer the question that was asked for Councillor Knight, the balustrading, do we know if it is original or a reproduction of an original feature?
I don't know that it's original, but I would hazard a guess that it's either original or very early in the property's history. It would be most unlikely that balustrading would have been added in the post-war years, for example. Possible, but unlikely. So I'd suggest it's either original or very early in the history of the group.
Colleagues, any other questions? Okay, well, I think the main question, whilst objections have been raised by things around privacy, I think the main question here refers to the aesthetic and character of the building as regards the, not the mansard, but the loss of the bottle balustrading and the infill. We've heard sort of both sides of the debate that large numbers of houses have already been infilled, so there is a very clear precedent on that square. It's not going to stand out on that square as strange in any way. However, it's an interesting feature, it might be original, and it's one of the few remaining examples of it left, so one could argue that, that therefore it is a loss to the conservation area. I think on balance, it's probably just about acceptable, but I don't know if colleagues have any other views they'd like to air before we proceed to a vote.
Is there any kind of conditions that can be added that would protect the original balustrading?
Well, I suppose the only one that could be considered would be to require the moving of the balustrading to the balcony on the second floor as it's infilled. So you would keep the balustrading, obviously not in its original position, and would that, the balustrading on either side would be at the lower level. So would that be an improvement on, maybe that would be an improvement on the current proposal? I don't know, Mr. Taylor, do you have any opinions on that as to whether that would be beneficial to keep that balustrading, albeit at a different level?
Well, I think And obviously that's a decision you'd have to come to as a committee. I mean, my view would be to include the balustrade, or at least a careful copy of the balustrade at the higher level. Probably would be. It would still retain something of the history, so I think that would be an improvement. I mean, that could be done through a condition. To do that, we would need to have details of the balustrade to make sure that it was the correct detailing to match the original, but that it would be possible to do that through a reasonable planning condition. Just to put both sides of it, I mean, clearly the balustrade isn't original at the higher level, so it could be said it's inappropriate at the higher level. But I think that's a view that obviously you can come to.
I know sometimes the balustrade at the front of properties, I've been on cases where they've removed it to grant car access, for example, but then they've placed it back where some modern fencing was, so at least you retain it. So I can see merit to that. Councillor Benton, Councillor Lane, any views on whether you think that would be a good condition to add?
Yes, I think that would somewhat help. I think it's just worth emphasising how important it is to retain these. As was mentioned previously, a number of houses on the square have had it removed and have iron railings. I think to some extent that is an even stronger reason to keep the balustrading, because it's almost now an endangered species of architectural design.
Makes sense to me.
Okay, well, I think we'd like to add that condition to the proposal, if that's okay.
It is, Chair. Can I just check one thing? Are you talking about retaining the whatever is down at the lower level, or are you talking about completely new bottle balustrades, but just to look similar to the ones that are currently there?
I think we could probably leave that with officers. I mean, my original thought was you would just use the same material, but it could break, it might not be structurally appropriate, so if not, then recreating something which looked the same. I mean, over the years there may have been cracks and they may have replaced balustrades, but I think the important thing is that it looks the same. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll allow officers to figure out the exact details of that, but in principle we'll add that as a condition that balustrading to be retained, albeit at the higher level. In which case we proceed to a vote with that additional condition attached. Can all those in favour of the proposal please raise their hand? Those against? And no abstentions, so that's 3 to 1 in favour, so the application is passed.
It's also subject to the legal agreement, of course, but that's in the recommendation.
Okay, yes, subject to legal agreement in the proposal. So we now proceed to 103 Elgin Crescent.
Thank you. Just to assist you, that's the last report in the North Pack that you have in front of you. Essentially, planning permission is sought here for various alterations. I think the key alteration is the construction of a rear extension at the lower ground floor level. And I'll take you through some slides to demonstrate that. The first slide that I'm showing there is the existing building, so that's 103 Elgin Crescent. And you can see there very clearly the canted bay extension which exists at the lower 2 floor levels on the rear elevation. So you can see the rear garden that backs onto the listed communal gardens, as you'll have seen discussed in the report. And the position for the proposed extension is basically the lower section of the 2-storey canted bay that you can see there. The next image basically shows the other side of the gap, so that's now 105 Elgin Crescent. And you can see there, again, there is a 2-storey canted bay. The context, basically, is that there are a small number of properties, I think there are 4 in all, that are basically bookend properties. And the bookend properties have 2-storey canted bays, as you see there. This is another one at number AC1. And if you look at the two together, that's a key perspective, I think. So that basically shows the importance of the bookends, how they relate to each other. And you can see there the relationship between 103 and 105 is obviously a very close one. You will note that 105 retains its bottle balustrade at roof level, and 103 doesn't have it. Part of this proposal is to reinstate the bottle balustrade up at the top parapet level. But essentially, the role that the bookend properties play, the bookend properties relate to each other as much as they do the properties on the other end of the terrace. And that's, I think, an important concept. You will have seen in the report discussion relating to an appeal on a previous proposal, and the appeal inspector recognised the importance of that relationship, and I think it's definitely key to assessing the proposals before you. That's just a high-level view, just looking across at the roof level. So you can see there more clearly the relationship between the two bookends at the roof level. And that's the existing rear elevation in drawing form, so just following the photograph that you've already seen. And that's the proposed rear elevation, so I'll go backwards for you. So if you look at the roof level, you can see the changes proposed at roof level. And then if you look at the lower part of the image, you can see down here the existing 2-storey canted bay, which would change to that. So what you can see at the lower level is that the proposed extension is basically picking up on the form of the canted bay. It's extending outwards, but it's taking its cue from the form of the bay. That's actually very different to the dismissed appeal. So I'll just briefly show you the refused rear elevation. So you can see there what was rejected by the inspector, which clearly is a very different development to the extension that's now proposed. In plan form, again, you can see there the extension is basically picking up on the canted form of the existing bay. You can see it's obviously projecting further out, but the existing bay above it, you can see there in its profile, in its footprint, and then you can see the extension lower down in its own footprint. And then in section, there you can see the upper ground floor level bay sort of clearly indicated in section, but where it is at the moment. And then that's the extension wrapping around it at the lower ground floor level. And I think that was the last slide, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. So we're joined by 2 objectors. Sophia Lambert, speaking on behalf of the Ladbroke Association, and Graham Child. You have 3 minutes to be shared between you. Obviously, split it however you wish to do so. And please start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Could I ask the committee to have a look at the second Ladbroke objection, which lists the points where we think the officer's report has got it wrong, because I don't want to have to go through them all since you presumably all read it. What I would like to say is that these rear extensions, highly decorated rear extensions on communal gardens, are one of the jewels in the architectural crown of the Royal Borough. I don't think they exist anywhere else in London. Some of the best ones really are unrivaled. And they are a really important heritage resource. And what's more, the Rosmead Garden ones are among the finest and also the best preserved and least altered. So we're really genuinely baffled as to how the officers can think that it's acceptable to have this sort of extension. The especially as only a few months ago, they turned down, refused under delegated powers, an alteration to a window at 31 Elgin Crescent, a single window, because it was going to interfere with the fenestration. And yet here, we are faced with a whopping great 2.4 metre, or is it 2.3 metre extensions sticking out. So it's, and I may say we'd be very happy to show any members of the committee round the communal gardens, and like that, I think you may appreciate more how special they are. We're concerned also that if this is allowed, it will mean that it would be impossible to refuse permission. Indeed, it would be unfair to refuse permission to anybody else who wanted to do anything to the bookends. Reference has been made to number 79, which has got a slight extension at its ground level, but it extends something like, what, 12 inches? Something of that sort, not 2.4 metres. I don't know, Derek, would you like to show the photograph of number 79? Yeah, there.
Well, that's 81.
It's 81.
That's 81, actually.
It's 81.
Out of the picture. I don't think he has a picture of 81.
Oh, well, maybe. Anyway, there is one that has extended itself slightly.
No, not there. That's not been extended.
It's not been extended, Graham's. Graham's correcting me. I thought we had a photograph of 79. I'm sure we sent one.
Well, it hasn't
Anyway,
it hasn't appeared.
none of the others has been touched to this extent. It was quoted in the officer's report as having had an extension, which is why I quoted it.
We have 79 in our packs,
Yeah.
by the way, so we can take a look at it in our pack. Yeah.
But Graham is one of the people who actually live on the terrace, and I hope he will tell you that it's not just the Ladbroke Association being purist.
We have come to the end of the 3 minutes. I'm very sorry to say. We unfortunately have to stick to the time limits, otherwise we can be... Sorry, that was three minutes to be shared, and so that's 3 minutes. I'll give you 30 seconds, and then I'll give the same to the applicant, if you just want to say a couple of sentences.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman. I live on this garden, have done for 25 years. I think it's most important that these paired bookends should be retained as they are, and I am very pleased at the way that the thing has been presented by the Chairman of the Ladbroke Association. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can come back in questions, but yeah, we'll come back to you in questions. Thank you very much. We're now joined by Tracy Rust on behalf of the applicant. Yes, hello. You also have, well, 3.5 minutes, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Firstly, I think it's important to note that a significant number of buildings in Elgin Crescent, which back onto the communal gardens, have rear extensions at the lower ground floor level. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, they're not all that sensitive when you're not close to them. I'll let you restart.
Shall I start again?
Yes.
Is that better? Is that better? Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, whenever you're ready.
I'll start again. Thank you. So I think it's important to note that a significant number of buildings in Elgin Crescent, which back onto the gardens, have rear extensions at the lower ground floor level. These extensions, having been built at different times over the years, vary in terms of size and styles, and as such there is no even rhythm or uniformity along the terrace, but rather an established pattern of development at the lower ground floor level, and particularly numbers 81 to 103, in which the application property sits. As your officer's report comments in paragraph 6.6 and 6.7, there is no even rhythm to rear extensions within the group, and the proposed extension here would be smaller in depth to others, including that at number 93. I think also it's important to draw your attention to the planning permission that was granted 2 months ago for 115 Elgin Crescent, which is an end of terrace property. It's one of the end bookends. The garden level of number 103 sits lower than the communal gardens. This, together with the mature trees and vegetation along the central garden boundary, means that views into the lower garden levels are extremely limited, minimising the visual impact, therefore, of such lower ground extensions. This is reaffirmed in your officer's report at paragraph 6.5, wherein it states, only the top part of the extension would be readily visible from the listed gardens, and that would be at least partially screened by the existing and well-maintained dense planting bordering Rosemead Gardens in the communal area and the private garden area of the property itself. Further, we note the Council's Conservation and Design Officer comments that the proposal, and I quote, is for a modest domestic extension which respects the design and proportions of the existing main rear elevation and the setting of the listed gardens. In our view, therefore, and that of your officers, no harm would arise as a result of the lower ground floor rear extension at 103. Other alterations are modest in nature. Reinstatement of the bottle balustrade at roof level is an enhancement to the building and is welcomed, as noted in your officer's report and as mentioned by Mr. Taylor. Overall, the proposals do comply with the aims and objectives of the local plan as confirmed in your senior officer's report, and we trust, therefore, that you will come to the same conclusion and grant planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we now proceed to questions to the objectors or the applicant. Colleagues, who has questions? Yes, Councillor Lane.
For the objector, in terms of your objections, is it principally the increased mass, the size you're objecting to, or are there any stylistic architectural features that you're objecting to?
Well, it's both, really. I mean, the increase in mass would be enormous and very visible, and it's not just the top bit of it. It can be, you can look very easily down the gentle slope in the garden. In fact, those photographs show it. But you saw the one on number 81. That was fitted very well with the rest of the bay. This one doesn't. It's quite clearly a modern extension. It may follow the shape, but it's not really suitable for that bay. And I would just point out that we're not saying that this equates to the other extensions along the terrace. It's only the bookending ones, which are a feature and which have all been preserved, apart from number 115, right at the end and almost out of view, which got its first extension, I don't know, in the 1980s, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions? I have a couple of questions. We just had a bit of context about 115, but to the applicants, what's the planning permission for recent planning permission for 115 you were referring to?
Sorry. That was, what was there previously was a bay-style extension similar to what we are now proposing, and what's been approved at 115 is for a squared-off extension, a much larger extension. But also I think it's worth noting that 117, which is the other side of Rosemead Gardens, that's the road, not the actual communal gardens, so it's the other bookend, if you like, further along Elgin Crescent, was also granted permission. That's a huge lower ground floor extension, which was granted about 3 or 4 years ago. So there is an established pattern of development of the lower ground floors, and not just on the central buildings, but also those bookends. So this isn't the only one, shall we say.
Okay, that's accepted, but I think the objectors would probably say that this is, in some cases, or in that particular case, at 115, 117, there were applications granted some time ago before planning was maybe so conservation orientated, and therefore protecting where we have sort of original mirror images is more important than where, unfortunately, we've lost it in the past. Would you recognise that?
Well, I would disagree, obviously. But what in your officer's report as well, she does comment that whilst you've got 103 and 105 as bookends and their repair, she said you don't ever read them, you won't see them as a pair when viewed from the communal gardens because of the fact that they sit lower and the dense vegetation and mature trees, etc. So the visual impact, therefore, is not material enough to warrant refusal of the scheme, and that is commented in your officer's report.
Thank you very much. I have a question for the objectors. To what extent do you think the excuse me, the reinstatement of the bottle balustrades, back to our friend, the bottle balustrades, probably talked about them more tonight than most people will hear about bottle balustrades in a lifetime, but to the reinstatement of the bottle balustrades at roof level, which actually makes it, improves its relationship to its mirror image, to its other fellow bookend, which has the bottle balustrades. Do you see that as an improvement? And would you consider that being perhaps more visible might outweigh the fact that the extension at the bottom reduces its similarity?
Well, thank you very much. I want to just say that I'm one of three residents who has objected to this, and the other two, one has COVID and the other couldn't get here anyway. But the answer to your question is no. I mean, we're all in favour of restoring the bottle balustrade, of course, but the issue is the significantly increased mass. And the comment that it can't be seen is belied by the photo. The photo very clearly shows what can be seen. And it's a feature of the end of terrace houses that they are very visible. Thank you.
We welcome the replacement of the bottle balustrade, which makes up for the fact that they're also proposing to alter the original dormer window to give it an extra light, because that'll be partly hidden. And that we see, although we don't like the extension of the dormer window, we see as a good trade-off. But it really is not relevant to what is happening down below, which is a far more serious issue.
So on the whole, as a whole, you don't see it as a good trade-off, but
Yeah.
if it was just a dormer window, then it would
I should also just add that 117 is in another communal garden. Each communal garden has its own characteristics, and it's quite wrong ever to try and say that there's a precedent.
Thank you. Colleagues, any more questions for the objectors or applicants? Yes, Councillor North.
Sorry to go back to visibility from the common gardens, I understand. Visibility from other buildings certainly look onto this, am I correct?
Sorry, there.
So we talked about visibility of this from the common gardens is obscured by trees, but from the other buildings it will be seen, is that correct?
The communal gardens are surrounded by the backs of the buildings that are on them. It's not like a garden square where there's a road in between. So the other buildings in the garden can see what's happening in other bits of it. In some instances right across the garden, but clearly what's happening in the neighbouring properties. And of course it's visible from the communal gardens, which are public spaces, since anybody living on a communal garden has a right to go in them.
Thank you.
Okay, so no other questions at this stage. We'll move on to the next section of the meeting. So this means that I'm afraid we can't go back and ask, no matter how much we might want to, we can't go back and ask additional questions of either objectors or applicants. So we move on to questions to officers. Colleagues, any questions for officers? Yes, Councillor Lane.
In relation to the other buildings on the Crescent that have had some rear extension, are any of those rear extensions either pre-war or contemporaneous with the construction of the original buildings, or are they all sort of 10, 20 years old, quite recent?
Well, I mean, there are quite a number of properties, as we've heard, that do have rear extensions. What I would say, though, is that in terms of context, I'd suggest that not very much weight should be given to extensions to mid-terrace buildings, because the key to this assessment is the bookend. It's the end of terrace situation. So there are certainly quite a few other extensions. They're fairly recent. The majority of extensions, I'd suggest, would have been in the 80s, 90s, noughties. They are reasonably recent. But they are generally in the middle of the terraces. So I think really the focus should be on the relationship between 103 and 105 and the visibility of the extension and so on, rather than comparing these two with a mid-terrace property further along that may have a 1990s extension.
I have a question. So I know you don't like hypotheticals, but to what extent is the recommendation to grant due to the reinstating of the bottle balustrade? Are we saying that the lower ground extension is a slight negative, but it's sort of cancelled out by the reinstatement of the bottle balustrade, or are we saying it's actually acceptable by itself?
I'd suggest that the bottle balustrade is definitely part of the equation. I mean, if you look at the photograph that's on the screen at the moment, you can see that at the lower ground floor level, at the garden level, the two properties obviously are not identical, because number 105 at some point in its history has had French doors inserted. So clearly there is some difference now at the lower level. The proposal before you obviously would still end up with a difference at the lower level. But what it would do is at least restore some parity at the higher level, which is more evident. Clearly you see the roof from a lot more perspectives than you would do the lower ground floor. I think it definitely is a key part of the equation. On that, actually, I'll take this opportunity to suggest that if the committee overall is minded to grant, at the moment, there's no condition actually compelling the applicant to install the bottle balustrade at the top level. So I think, although there are conditions dealing with various details, there's no condition that prevents an under-implementation of any permission granted. So if ultimately you do decide to grant permission, I think we do need an extra condition that ensures the bottle balustrade is actually instated.
Well, I think, colleagues, do we agree that we should definitely add that as a condition on the proposal that we vote on, because that's, I think, clearly beneficial. So, yes, please, can we add that condition? Any other questions for officers? No. Okay. In which case, we must proceed to a vote. I think it is quite finely balanced. The preservation of sort of original features like original architecture, like these bookends. I mean, they obviously bring a very high contribution to the conservation area and to the borough. This is as extensions go, probably as modest an extension as we are likely to get. But that doesn't mean in itself that it's acceptable. And there is the sort of benefit of reinstating the bottle balustrades, but we might decide that that does not outweigh the what would likely be the permanent change of that lower ground floor extension. So as to whether that's whether that trade-off is worth taking or not, is, as I say, finely balanced. Does anyone have any thoughts before we proceed to a vote? No. In which case, could All those in favour, please raise their hands. And those against, I will vote against. So that's 3 to 1, and obviously no abstentions. So the application is passed, and we thank very much everyone who joined us to make representations. We now proceed to number 51, Cathcart Road, and we hand over, that's south, isn't it? So yeah, Mr. Lau, over to you.
Evening, Chair members. This is the application at 51 Cathcart Road, agenda item 49 in the South Pack. Members should also be aware that there is an addendum that has been circulated for this particular item. It concerns amendments to several paragraphs within the report itself. The site in question is the garage and former substation adjacent to 51 Cathcart Road. The application should be noted that it's not for full planning permission, and therefore members are only considering details sought to be discharged under the condition attached to a 2019 permission, which was for the demolition of the existing garages, substation, and the construction of a new dwelling house with a basement. Those conditions sought under this current applications are condition 3, which was for a construction, a CTMP. Condition number 4, which is for professional management of engineering works, and condition number 8, covering the protection trees during construction. Moving on to this particular slide, which shows the site location in question. This is outlined in red. It currently comprises a garage and this new substation. As you can see on this slide, there are terrace properties in the vicinity on Cathcart Road to the right, which is adjacent to the site itself. And also, at the same time, you have the rear gardens of Redcliffe Gardens properties just to the left of that site. By way of background, the 2019 planning permission was subject to a 3-year time limit, which basically expired on the 23rd of May of this year. The applicant submitted details to discharge a number of these pre-commencement conditions, the subject of this application, before this particular date, and therefore the council can still determine the application. The applicant has also carried out works on the site before the pre-commencement condition have been formally discharged. Moving on to the street context itself, this slide, also outlined in red, shows the existing garages and the substation, and also at street level, its relationship with the surrounding buildings. Moving on to the existing site photos, to keep the 2019 permission live, the existing garages and the former substations, which you can clearly see in both images, have already been demolished on the site. There's currently hoarding that has been erected around the site, and recent photos also show the 3 protected trees which are currently in place as part of this application. By way of context, in terms of the 2019 consent, this is an elevation of the 2-bedroom dwelling granted in 2019. The development itself was 3 stories in height, of which 2 was above ground level with a basement level, so 3 stories in total, and it was physically attached to the end of the terrace at number 51 Cathcart Road with the continuation of the boundary. Moving on to the tree protection itself, there are 3 trees that are within and in proximity to the site, which all will be protected during the construction works. There is a T1 tree, which you can see outlined in blue. That particular tree is a category 2 tree, and that's situated on the street itself. There are 2 further T2 and T3 trees, which are considered category 3 trees of lower quality within the site and along the boundary. All these trees and the protection measures set out by the applicant's team have been reviewed by the Council's Agricultural Officer, to which they raised no particular objections and found the details within those protection measures to be sufficient. Lastly, move on to this last slide regarding the proposed site access itself submitted under the CTMP. A site office will be located directly opposite the site. The applicant is proposing to use a conveyor belt system. This will be supported by a scaffolding system frame that will be employed to remove spore from the site. And this will basically remove the spore from the site itself into a waiting lorry, which would wait up to 60 minutes at a time on the carriageway. Although it will cross the highway, it will be a minimum 2.5 metre high from ground level to ensure safe and free flow pedestrian traffic would not be impacted as a result of this particular operation. The existing parking bays at either side will not be affected or suspended, as you can clearly see. As a result of all these details, the revised CTMP Revision B, which was submitted after the original submission of the details, were received by the Council in May of this year. Local residents were notified of this particular revised document via the weekly list. The Council's Highway Officer has reviewed the details of the amended document and considered them to be acceptable. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're joined this evening by two objectors, Melanie Blake and Alexander Berger. Are you with us this evening? Hello. Thank you for joining us. You have 3 minutes to share between you. So if you give me 1 second. There we go. And please start whenever you're ready.
The first we knew about the application was when demolition started. The council asserts that consultation letters were sent out, yet none of the 4 flats at 38 Redcliffe received one. The same happened when the contractor was supposed to notify of impending works. They and Daniel Watney have admitted they sent no letters to us. This is very curious and indicates a serious clerical error from the very beginning, in which properties were omitted altogether. This failure to notify on both counts has enormous ramifications for the validity of this permission, as those objecting have not been properly heard, let alone had time to prepare. For this reason alone, we believe permission should never have been granted and should be rescinded. The process should be completely restarted to allow for proper representation by those affected, allowing us to comment on any proposed redesign. The developer's documents are a great box-ticking exercise, but there has been complete disregard for the requirements. Skips are being used, the highway gets blocked, dust is inadequately suppressed with a handheld spray, and the site is left uncovered. Trees are not being protected, one has died, neighbours are not being consulted or notified, and noise and vibrations are forcing us out of our homes and preventing us from working. The design is not in keeping with the local architecture or appropriate for the conservation area. It is comprised of modern elements not found locally and will look completely out of place. Removing a garage and adding a home adds to pressure on parking. Permission has been granted for a 3-storey building blocking light when smaller proposals were previously rejected. How can this be? At 38 Redcliffe, we have structural problems, including subsidence. Since drilling started, cracks have reappeared on existing fault lines. The floor is coming up in a neighbouring property. We need to be satisfied that digging foundations right next to ground that is already moving is not going to cause a serious accident with potential loss of life. For a multitude of reasons, it is abundantly clear to us that planning should not have been granted in the first place. I'll hand over to Melanie.
Hi, sorry, I've got laryngitis, so I'll try and be fast. So I'm in the studio house, which as you can see in the picture right behind it. We agree, I represent everybody from 36, including Cathcart behind me. We have an agreement with everything that Alex has said, but we have an alternative idea as to how to get around it, and that would be to abandon the basement and go up 1 extra flight, because we feel that that's the most damage that's being done to the properties by going down rather than going up. We were never informed, Nobody ever received anything in any of these addresses, and this has gone on for years until we reached this point. And already the damage from the work that's been done to demolish is quite substantial, and that's just from demolishment. To wrap up, from my perspective, my house is fully detached, and if they were to join my house where they go backwards, there would be no access points to ever get to any area of my house to fix anything in the future. So that in itself would be an impossible situation. But we would accept, and this is myself, 36, 38, there's a lot of flats, we would accept a trade-off of abandoning the basement and going up an extra height, so it was 3 flights, but we would completely agree the design is wrong.
Thank you very much. We're now also joined by Mr. McCallum on behalf of the applicant. Are you with us this evening? Yes. Hello, Mr. McCallum. Thank you for joining us. You also have 3 minutes, and so please start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. My name's Kieran McCallum. I'm the agent for the application. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. The application before you is for 3 conditions relating to a permission already granted in 2019. The first concerns the appointment of a civil engineer to oversee engineering operations, and we've submitted evidence that they've been instructed to oversee anything that would, all works that will have an engineering component to them, specifically demolition and the excavation of a basement. So they have been instructed. The second relates to trees and arboricultural matters. Their protection method and the survey have been signed off by the arboricultural officer. And I understand that there is a tree has been removed on site. There's T1 and T2 and T3. One tree which falls outside of the application boundary has been removed. It is not on the applicant's land, and we submitted photographs to the planning officer which demonstrate we had a kind of a pre-assessment, a pre-start site visit, and the tree was gone. We genuinely don't know who removed it, but it certainly wasn't the applicant or anyone acting on their behalf. And in light of that and the protection for the other 2 trees, then that has been agreed with officers. The third is the CTMP. That was worked up in line with the pro forma that RBKC produced, and in the context of similar documents that have been approved nearby. So its routing, its methods are the same as those that have been employed in the area, and make sure that they that it takes into consideration the local context. One amendment was necessary, and that was for the method of spoil removal. We agreed with the officers that there was a better way of achieving that, and that was through a conveyor belt system that will be employed on site. The application before you is for the terms of those conditions, for the information that has been submitted for those 3 conditions. And given our overlap with agreement with your officers, I'd ask that you grant planning permission for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we now move on to questions to objectors or the applicant. I'll just remind colleagues at this point that points have been raised which are completely understandable, and sort of a number of frustrations with the original planning application. And I just need to remind colleagues that unfortunately what we can't do tonight is go back and look at that original planning application. If there are concerns on procedural grounds, there may be an opportunity to make representations around the procedure, but tonight that's not something we can look at. Not something we're able to look at as a planning applications committee, and so we do have to confine ourselves to those 3 conditions, and that's what we have to make a decision on tonight. So whether the CTMP is acceptable, whether the proposed demolition and excavation works will be managed by an appropriately qualified individual, and whether the proposals would have an acceptable impact on trees. And so, however much we may want to find out more about other things, we do need to confine ourselves to those three things, and I hope you understand. So, questions, colleagues? Yes, Councillor North.
My question is going to be the same to the objector as the supporter and also the officers about the tree, the big mystery of the tree. Can you tell us which tree has gone and what happened to it? Is the question initially to the objectors and the...
who would you like to ask first?
The objectors first.
The objector.
So the tree mysteriously fell over around about 2 weeks after a report was published in which we were told that it needed to be protected.
Can you indicate from the plan which one it is? T1, T2, T3?
It's T3.
T3. Who removed it? Was it removed?
It was removed by the owner of 51A because it's in her garden.
Thank you.
Would you like to put the same question to the applicant?
Please.
That's not my understanding. We don't know who removed the tree. We performed a site visit and took some photographs. Later on, we understood that the tree had been removed, went back and looked at the photographs and realised it was not there anymore. But that was before the contractor had started on site, before works had commenced. Yes, we simply genuinely don't know what happened to it.
But the tree in question, is it T3?
It is T3, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so we agree on that point.
Yes, and my understanding as well was that it was not in the control of the applicant. I made sure to ask my building consultancy colleagues they have instructed the contractor whether that was the case, where it would lie and who would be responsible for it. They assured me that it was not on their land, so they would not have almost the right to remove it. Not that they would have if they owned it.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? And I suspect we may also want to speak to officers about that. Sorry, Mr. McCallum. Sorry. Does T3, does its absence affect your building works? Are you building, or presumably you're not building exactly where that tree was? You couldn't do according to plans, but does it have an impact on your building works?
No, it wouldn't have impacted construction. There's certainly kind of low-level protection measures that would have been best practice for all three trees. We'll be carrying them out for the other two remaining trees, of course. But it is not any more or less obtrusive than say T2, and doesn't impact the plans for the actual construction. No.
Okay, and I'll put a sort of similar question to the objectors. Do you feel that there's a significant gain to the applicant by the removal of that tree?
Yes, absolutely. They no longer have to protect it. And it's my understanding from the owner of 51A that they are seeking to actually have the rear wall removed of the garden of 51A and be allowed to use 1 metre of space to construct their property. So its disappearance is very convenient.
We might have, thank you, we might have some follow-up questions on that with officers. Colleagues, other questions? Yes, Councillor Lane.
For the applicant, has the removal of that tree, without speaking to how or why it was removed, has it affected the financial cost of the development from the applicant's perspective in any way at all?
Certainly not to my knowledge. We'll still be obliged to have an instructed arboriculturalist and carry out tree protection measures for the other 2 trees. Doing it to two trees and doing it to 3 trees is almost immaterial in difference as far as funding or costs go.
I have a question for the applicant, for Mr. McCallum. We heard objectors refer to subsidence on their properties and vibration based on the works that have been carried out so far. Is this something you're aware of, and can you tell us what you're doing to ensure there is not subsidence or vibrations?
Well, it's definitely not something that I've been made aware of, or specific examples of it happening. There is the ability to tell the contract straight away, and we would be responsible for that should any damage be caused. And I believe that they haven't been agreed yet, but party wall agreements will be made with all relevant neighbouring buildings. They are all work has stopped on site as well until those agreements are made.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Yes, Councillor North.
Then the flip side of that coin is to the objectors. Have you reported the subsidence, or have you got any evidence to back this up? And if so, who and when did you report it to?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I have reported it to Daniel Watney LLP. I've reported it directly to their civil engineer. I had no reply from him. And I went out, I also emailed the contractor, G.A. Harper, and I went out and spoke to the site manager, who tried to assure me that nothing would happen, but I did point out to him that cracks have started appearing, and he did look concerned.
I've also done the same and been ignored, and the same people. But I would like to say very quickly, just I do find it very bizarre. I know we can't go back to 2019, that case that nobody was ever aware of, that we can't suggest back to the developer that there is an alternative to go up rather than down, which decreases nearly all of the problems, not their problems. I just find it very bizarre we can't mention it. So, but yes, I concur, exactly the same.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not saying that discussion can't be had. I'm just saying we can't have it in this forum. But yeah, no, I understand. It's just not. It wouldn't be for us to decide procedurally.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying that they would not be aware that we have come to an agreement, a separate side of the whole area, saying we would not object to a bigger building, which would be better for them.
Thank you, colleagues. Other questions? No. Okay. In which case, thank you all very much. We now move on. As I say, to the next phase of the meeting, which is questions just to officers. Colleagues, who has questions for officers? Councillor Lane?
My same question to officers as to the applicant. In your view, does the disappearance of that tree, or would it make any financial difference whatsoever to the cost for the applicant?
And I'll just add to that on the same topic. Are we aware? Have we required the replacement of that tree?
Under the current wording, obviously, it requires the protection of the three trees. There's nothing in the current wording of that specific conditions which states that in the event that the tree shall be removed for whatever reason during the course of the construction, it has to be replaced. Obviously, what's transpired has the fact that recently the tree in question, which is considered of a lower quality, but T3 has been removed as a result of maybe works that have occurred on the site, because obviously the demolition of the existing substation and the garages have taken place. I can't confirm why the tree has been removed. I have been on site this morning, which you can see from the site photos on the other slides, that you can see the street tree, which is the T1, the more of the prominent trees, which offers more amenity value to the streets. That's currently in situ, as well as T2, which sits just behind that, and that's within the application sites. But going back to your original question, there is nothing within the current wording to suggest that there shall be a replacement in the event that one of those trees, which should be protected in construction, has to be replaced.
And could I ask about the timing of the tree removal? I think it was suggested it was... Sorry, I just want to clear up the exact timing and the location of the tree. because it's been suggested it was either on someone else's land and potentially before the applicant took control of the site. Could you give us a bit more clarity on that?
Obviously, what you see in front of you is the location of the 3 trees in question. T1 is obviously on the street itself. Where you see that vertical pink line, that's where the hoarding forms part of where the construction site will be situated. And you can see T3 falls within the construction zone, along with the protection measures, which is indicated by the vertical dotted line. You have the T2 tree, which sits just outside, abutting the construction hoarding itself. So that image basically shows you the location of the trees in relation to the street itself, as well as within the construction hoardings that has been currently erected around the site.
But timing-wise, I mean, it was obviously after, because my concern is we issued the initial permission in 2019. There were these 3 conditions that had to be charged, one of which was appropriate measures for protecting the trees. And since then, one of those trees has come down, which is obviously the opposite of protecting it. The arboricultural officer has said that the methods submitted to him or her of protecting those trees are acceptable, which I don't doubt, wouldn't question. But one of them has actually come down, which, you know, obviously isn't protecting the tree. So, I mean, I don't want us to try and figure out as a committee here today why that tree's come down, and, you know, it could be completely innocent or it could be otherwise, we don't know. But it is a concern. I don't know how we address that. Would it be appropriate, for example, to condition the replacement of that tree?
Chairman, if I may answer. So I think what we need to do here is divorce the 2 issues. So we've got a tree protection plan which does show 3 trees in situ, and it appears that one has come down by whatever means. And that's for our trees team to investigate and then consider whether or not serving a tree replacement notice on the owner is something that we ought to do. Now, it is an offence to remove a tree in a conservation area, but ultimately we need to do an investigation as to why that done. And it might well be that it, you know, was dead or decaying in some way, but that's really for us to investigate. So it is a separate matter. I appreciate that obviously the tree protection plan shows a tree that's not in situ, and what we can't do is we can't condition a condition. We could put an informative on to say, you know, it is noted that T3 has been removed or is no longer standing, and that matter will be investigated by the arboricultural team and action taken where necessary. It is usually the case that a tree that we have secured retention of through a development scheme, if it so happens that tree is removed for whatever reason, we would usually ask for a tree replacement. There is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do, particularly if we felt that the development that was approved could be carried out with the retention of that tree, which we did in granting permission in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful. So, you know, our decision as regards to trees is really very limited this evening just to that plan for protection, but that doesn't mean that other arms of the council won't pursue the issue of the disappearing tree. And as we heard quite likely, and I think it probably would be a good idea for us to add an informative saying that you know, we believe it would be a good idea for that tree to be required to be replaced. Could I ask just about again, it sort of is very on the very limit of what's relevant to us, our decision this evening, but the subsidence and structural issues that we've heard about, presumably there are conditions in the original permission that can be drawn upon to address those issues, and if necessary, if there's evidence of subsidence or structural issues, to halt construction until that issue is completely resolved. Is that correct?
I'm just going through the original permission. So obviously your question is concerned about structurally how the development would impact on neighbouring properties. Obviously, as part of the 2019 permission, through the officers' assessments, officers would have assessed the impact through the excavation, the new basement, because obviously it would definitely have some form of environmental impacts, whether it be surface water runoff or structural sort of impact to neighbouring properties. The original permission would have been part of that would have been accompanied by some form of basement impact assessment as well, and that would have been set out by the applicant's team, to which obviously officers would have interrogated those details. So if it was felt that there could be some potential impact through maybe the construction method or the actual extent and the size of the basement, then those concerns would have been raised at that time. Obviously, plan permission has been granted back in 2019. It was considered, notwithstanding the development included a basement floor, was considered acceptable in amenity terms, as well as structurally how it impacted on the other properties. I can't see any particular conditions to which you're referring to in terms of safeguarding the structural stability of adjoining properties, but at the same time it will still need to go through building regulations to ensure that it would have to be carried out in a manner to ensure that it will be safe, not only for the owners of the property but the adjoining properties. And actually one of the conditions which you are considering is for a qualified consultant or structural engineer to oversee the completion and construction of the entire development, including the subterranean development. And that's the reason why that condition was imposed in the first place, to ensure that it would carry out in a safe manner and not have any sort of significant impact on the surrounding environment. So not specifically to the structural side, but obviously the condition related to this would be overseen by a professional and qualified consultant.
Okay, well, I mean, my thoughts are just that the objectors have come to us tonight and have made us aware of some serious concerns around structural issues in their homes. And so whilst we are very limited in terms of what we can make a decision on tonight, we shouldn't ignore those. So whether it's just adding it to the minutes or putting it as an informative, I think the relevant part of the council should get in touch with those objectors and go and visit their properties, make the investigations necessary, and take the appropriate action. That's not really part of our decision, but if we could minute that or add it as an informative. Okay, we'll minute that, so we would expect that to take place, having heard what we've heard tonight. And I think, unless colleagues object, we'll also add that informative that the removal of the tree should be investigated if it isn't already, and in this committee's opinion, a tree replacement order would be appropriate. Okay. So, but both cases that's minuted. So whilst, as I say, is very limited what we can take a decision on, hopefully, at least that will address some of the concerns that you, the objectors, have raised this evening. Colleagues, any other questions before we proceed? Yes, Councillor North.
Yes, the officers. Consultation. How many properties did we consult with? How many letters were sent out?
Just to clarify, was that about the original application or
this current one?
This current one to approve the conditions.
Have received any?
It's not a statutory requirement for the local plan authority to notify neighbours on discharge of planning conditions. It has been known that in the event that of a controversial scheme, letters may be sent out, but it's not in every instance. Under this particular discharge of planning condition, the local plan authority did not specifically send out letters, so individual properties did not receive a letter of notification informing them of the details to be considered by the council or by members of the chair tonight, but it was advertised in the weekly list as well as the local newspaper, so it was put out there in the public domain, but not specific letters sent to individual properties.
Did we put anything on the lamppost or the tree?
No, okay. No site notice. As per the legislation requirements, there's no statutory duty to actually put up a publication to that effect.
Just to add, it would have been published on the weekly list, which is residents and others can sign up to, and that includes a list of all applications received, so it would have been published in some way. Yeah.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Yeah. In which case, we must proceed to a vote. Then objectors have raised some important concerns this evening, and I think we can feel confident that the relevant officers within the council will be making contact with them regarding particularly the structural concerns, and also that the tree removal will be investigated. But in terms of the very specific decisions in front of us tonight, I can't see any planning reason personally why they would not be deemed acceptable. Does anyone have any other views before we proceed to a vote? No. Okay, in which case, would all those in favour of the proposal please raise their hands? All those against? Any abstentions? No, well, obviously not. So that's 3-1 in favour, and the conditions are discharged. And thank you very much to everyone who joined us to speak on that case. We now proceed to 56 to 58 Hornton Street, which Mr. Taylor, I think you're presenting for.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So that the application before you this evening proposes a lead-clad turret on the northeastern corner of the building at roof level. And the first image I'm showing you there shows the existing building before building work started on the current planning permission. So you can immediately see that this is a corner building. It's not actually part of the Holland Street Terrace that you see on the right-hand side, and it's not part of any other terrace. It's a one-off building on the corner. Planning permission has been granted for an extension to the mansard roof that you see there in the photograph. The permitted extension would basically extend the mansard rearwards on the building. And the proposed turret isn't part of that mansard roof. It's around the back that you'll see in the next image. Or maybe not the next image, but one of the forthcoming images. That's a view taken now from street level, sort of shortly after work started, I think, on the existing planning permission, with Holland Street there to the right-hand side. And that's now the rear. So you can see that the existing building has, I'll call this a hexagonal extension at the rear that you can see at the left-hand side. You can see that the existing hexagonal, I don't know if it quite has 6 sides, I'll call it hexagonal. The extension has a parapet at the top and a flat roof, and that's the proposed position for the lead-clad turrets. And you can see there the proposed second floor, and I won't count the sides now, but I can see there are more than 6, but never mind. You can see there the proposed turret in its circular form, situated within the parapet that surrounds the extension. And then that's the proposed west elevation, the Hornton Street elevation. So you can see there the approved Mansard roof, and you can see the proposed turrets just poking up behind it at the left-hand side of the roof. And that's just a closer-up version of that, because I don't think it was too clear on the screens. And then on the left-hand side of this image, you have the consented north elevation or rear elevation. So you can see there the existing extension with the parapet terminating the extension at the upper level. And then the proposed elevation is on the right-hand side with that parapet raised slightly, and then the turrets in position on top of it. So that's the approved, under the existing permission, elevation on the left and the proposed elevation on the right-hand side. And that's just a closer-up view of that. And then that's a coloured-up version, just to give it some... and then the last image, that's taken, in fact, yesterday. Just taken, obviously, from Holland's Hornton Street, got it right, looking across at the rear of the property. And you can actually see in that photograph, that's the rear extension, where the turret would be on top of. And that's the last slide. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. So we have, am I right in saying we're just joined by speakers for the applicant? Oh, because, right, yeah, that was what was throwing me off. Yeah, thank you. So we're joined by Rita Apkarian, Gagik Apkarian, and Nick Lotbinier. Are you with us this evening? Sorry, I probably butchered that. I apologise.
It's a very difficult name. It's de Lotbinier, but I won't be insulted if anyone gets it wrong.
Yeah, de Lotbinier. Got it. Well, you have 3 minutes between you to address us, and then we can ask you questions. So whenever you're ready.
Good evening, councillors. Once again, I'm here in front of you, not only as a homeowner, but as a wife and a mother of 3 who's passionate and committed about my family home. This turret feature for my daughter's room will create just enough space for a desk and provide a home for longevity by adding 2 square meters. We're not asking for anything that will affect anyone's quality of life or hurt those around us, yet these changes make monumental differences. Even the planning officer states, in living condition terms, the additional height to the parapet is not extensive, which would mean that the proposal would not result in a sense of enclosure or loss of outlook. Basically, we're not doing anything wrong. Our struggles with this home date back to 2014, working alongside advisors who understand the local community, having worked in the borough for the last 30 years. Savills Planning, Donald Insull Architects, designed a well-thought-out home, all whilst retaining Sir Stamford's music room, which is so dear to us and takes up 75% of the ground floor. Although this house is not listed, we've gone through great pain to honour the blue plaque. Earlier this year, during the PAC on the 22nd of February, 2 of our applications, which the planning team had recommended for refusal, were overturned by your fellow councillors. I appreciate that these decisions are subjective. However, I would very much appreciate your support and grant us the turret. Thank you.
I'll talk very briefly about the formulation of the scheme, then the objections, and then the positive benefits as I see it. In terms of the formulation, this has always been considered a quirky building. It's not the sort of the classical order of many other buildings. And Donald Insull Architects have considered that the turret would add a positive element. We discussed it in principle with officers in 2017, and it was considered that it wasn't an unacceptable feature. Earlier this year, we submitted some options for the turret, and we are now proposing the one that was favoured. In terms of the conservation area, this is a conservation area in contrast to many, which has great variety of architecture, Georgian buildings, late Victorian, arts and crafts with all their flamboyance, Edwardian and modern. And there are 6 turrets within a very short distance in this conservation area. So I don't think it's an alien feature. In terms of the building itself, it's been described in the conservation area document as idiosyncratic. The turret sits on an orthogonal 8-sided projection. It's a fine and interesting slender finish in my view. It's below the mansard, causes no harm to amenity. So in terms of conclusions, I think it's a quirky building. It adds interest to it. It's well designed, well proportioned, less truncated form, doesn't impact on amenity, adds a bit more floor space for the use, and is a positive feature in my view.
Thank you very much. We are not joined by any objectors, so questions for the applicants. Councillor North.
Thank you. As the Chair said, it's disappointing that the objectors are not here to speak. So my question will be to the agent and applicant in this case. There is a huge wealth of documents and opinions that support this, and it has taken quite a lot of time for all of us to go through it. There is a lot of history to this building. We appreciate that, and we also appreciate the time that it's taken to get to where we are today. My question to you is, we understand that this is going to be a family home. You can confirm that is correct. And secondly... Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And secondly, the top of the actual turret, not the spire part, that comes in line with the roof. Am I correct in reading that from the drawings?
It's actually slightly below the roof. It's
Yes.
0.3 of a metre below the pitch of the mansard on the front of the building.
Okay.
Is that, sorry to cut in, is it the spike that then goes above the roof?
The finial does go above the roof, yes, but it's a very slender element of it.
I will add finial to my growing list of architectural vocabulary. Okay, thank you. Sorry, back to you, Councillor.
Thank you. And could I ask you about the window? Because I know there's been some comments about it overlooking gardens. From my understanding of the drawings, the window is, you can't lean out and look to the left or the right. It's just a simple see-through window that looks straight ahead. Am I correct in reading that?
That is indeed correct, yeah, yes.
Thank you.
It's a tilt and turn window, so you can only open it in the middle.
So nobody looking out that window can actually see into the garden next door, either side. It just looks straight ahead. That's correct.
It looks straight ahead, and there are windows, obviously, that are slightly closer already, lower down in the elevation.
Sure. We're also aware that there's a building that's just appeared to the north of the building, which is completely different architectural design to this as well. So there's a lot of work. We've taken a lot of time, the committee, to go through these papers, so thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Councillor Lane.
Thank you. Question to the applicants. I'm aware there's a historic music room forms part of the building. In terms of your application, did I read it right? You're going to preserve that, or you're going to restore it? Can you speak to that a bit more?
We definitely intend to restore it. That's why we bought the house. I fell in love with that music room, and so it's dictated the square footage and everything. It's controlled us, but I kind of thought it was my calling.
Any other questions? Just a quick one, not all that important, but sometimes I find it can be good to look at changes as a whole. So I just wonder why you decide to apply with, you split out the application into multiple applications rather than a single one.
Yes, well, I think the issue of, partly the issue of why this has come forward at this stage is that we wanted to reach agreement on the roof form and the alterations of the roof form, so that whatever we designed fitted in with the turret. And as mentioned before, the changes to the roof form came to committee actually with a recommendation for refusal, got approved by the committee back in February, I think it was. So once we'd have established that, then it became possible to design the turret in accordance with what had been approved for the roof. So that's why there's those applications are different, or the sequencing of them.
Okay, thank you. There's another question, because as you know from our report, there's questions raised over the appropriateness of the turret in the conservation area. I'm just looking for the line. I forgot to underline it, but it's about the fact that it's on the rear elevation rather than the front. Sorry, give me 1 second. I can't find it, but it was a line around the fact that it's on the rear of the building, not the front of the building, and that would sort of unbalance the building and draw undue attention to the back rather than the front facade. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I go back to the point that it is a very quirky building, and I think, you know, if you look at sort of arts and crafts buildings and others, they have little towers and turrets both at the back and at the front. And I feel that it's a slightly truncated form at the moment, and that this adds a little bit of a slender, interesting feature to the building at the rear, and is not something one should be ashamed about. I think it's a positive feature, and is, you know, well proportioned design, follows the option selected when we were discussing it with officers. So I think it's a positive feature. It doesn't seem to overwhelm the building. The materials and its proportions and its slender feel and the finial feature on the top and the round window, which you often see in turrets, I think works very well, and I think it's a positive thing. Its impact is, you could say, limited because it's, you know, 7 meters setback from the wall. There's trees and vegetation, so that the views of it are limited. But I don't think that's, to my mind, what is important is whether it's a good addition to the building. It's a good positive feature, so it doesn't matter whether it's visible or not. The question is whether it's a contribution, a positive contribution to the building, which we believe it is.
And thank you. And on a separate point, do you believe it introduces any new overlooking?
No, I don't think it introduces any overlooking, and I don't think the officers the officers agreed that there's no impact in that respect to adjoining properties. It's a high up window. The windows in the bay sections of that rear projection are closer to if we're talking about the property at the rear. So I don't think it really introduces any material increase in overlooking.
And sorry, going back to your previous point, because we've heard about other examples of turrets in the area, albeit on slightly different, generally larger types of buildings. But you said that there are some examples of turrets, or at least one example of turrets at the rear as well at the front, as well as at the front.
There are. They're not in this. They're not in the 6 examples, but there are. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Any other questions for the applicants? One moment. Okay, no, I've no other questions. Okay, in which case we proceed to questions to officers. Any questions for officers? Yes, Councillor North.
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting on this one. There's been pre-consultation. Can I ask, of the designs that were offered originally, was it just this one that was not recommended by the officers, or were there others that would have been recommended? So my question is, would there be an alternative site of design or style that would have been acceptable to the officers? Or is it just this one?
Well, I think obviously this evening you can only focus on what's before you. But to answer your question, I mean, I think there were probably more than 3 designs that were produced, but of the 3 designs that planning officers saw, that this one was the one of least impact.
Councillor Lane.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. First, and perhaps be good to have reference to the photograph that has the existing octagonal structure. If we could just pull that up. Yes, that's the one. I'd like to ask officers, what architectural style do you consider that original octagonal structure? Is it neo-Gothic? Is it arts and crafts? What do you consider it as?
That's a very difficult question to answer because immediately you can see some different styles, but it's got hints of arts and crafts about it. It's got hints of Victorian sort of materials and style about it. It's quite an eclectic mix of elements, and I think that's probably a fair comment for all parts of the building, actually. I mean, I know you were saying focus on the photograph, but if I went back to the comparative images, I mean, immediately there you can see different elements of style. I mean, it's got an arts and crafts theme to it.
And if I may just ask a few follow-up questions, in terms of the prevailing architectural style of the proposed turret, how would you describe that?
Well, if the Victorians were to build a turret, they probably would have clad it in lead, which is exactly what's proposed here. I mean, the turret is probably more Victorian, perhaps, than arts and crafts. But then, to be fair, the prevailing character of the conservation area is Victorian. So.
And if I may just ask a couple more questions. What weight have you placed on the applicant's decision to restore the historic music room? I know that there's letters from, I believe it was Stanford and Royal College of Music, might be the ones. Is that a significant material consideration? Have you placed weight on that?
No. I'd say, I mean, it's obviously very welcome, but this isn't a listed building. So, I mean, it's welcome to restore the interior. But it's not a requirement. It's not a listed building. You know, having said that, the building is obviously of historic interest because of it.
And if I just ask one final question, Mr. Chairman, in terms of point 6.6 under subheading evaluation, you talk about the sort of turret being uncharacteristic. Just to clarify, is it turrets, full stop, that are uncharacteristic? And say if it were in a neoclassical style, it would still be uncharacteristic? Or is it the design elements of this particular turret that are uncharacteristic in your view?
Well, I think, like many things in planning, you can look at this in two ways. Firstly, you could look at it in the sense that typically Victorian rear elevations are quite simple. Sort of, you'd expect the features on a Victorian building really to be on the front elevation, and the rears, you know, traditionally, therefore, would be simple. The rears, generally speaking, wouldn't have features that would attract interest. And I think that's one of the points discussed in the report. I mean, the other way to look at it is that there are turrets on buildings, there are features on buildings, and buildings always go through periods of change anyway. Even listed buildings get altered. And this building is obviously a one-off. It's not actually typical of buildings in the conservation area. It already has an octagonal extension at the rear, which in itself is unusual. So you can look at the building in that context as well.
Thank you.
Any more questions, colleagues? I was going to ask about that octagonal extension, but I think we had the answer. It's not. It's in no way typical of the area. It is a one-off, like much of the building. Yeah. And is there, in your opinion, any additional, because the report refers to the dominance of it, presumably that's just referring to sort of in a visual sense from someone on the street, we're not saying it adds to an either additional overlooking or an additional sense of enclosure to neighbours. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean the turret would not in any way materially affect neighbours' living conditions, either in terms of privacy or in terms of sense of enclosure or sun or daylight. I mean the word dominance is really just focusing upon the presence of the turret, the fact that the terrace is obviously designed to draw attention to the rear.
Any other questions? No. Okay, in which case we need to proceed to a decision. It's an interesting one. I think the report, officer's report and the opinion of the conservation officer is that it should not be granted. It's not a typical feature of the area, and it is obviously in the middle of a conservation area. I suppose, on the other hand, the applicant has made the point, and we've heard that reiterated by Mr. Taylor, that the house itself is very atypical, been described as quirky, and it is a one-off. So if we added an additional atypical feature, doesn't change the fact that the house itself is atypical, and the applicant would say adds interest to the house, and probably if it was built in Victorian times, I'm sure now we'd be looking to protect it. But I suppose that's the nature of conservation. In any case, we must proceed to a vote. Does anyone else have any comments before we vote on it? No. Okay. So just to be clear, before we vote, the recommendation is to refuse. So if you agree with that, when I say, are you in favour, and you say yes, you would be in favour of the refusal, not of granting it. So the recommendation is to refuse. All those in favour? So one in favour. All those against refusal? So that's 3 to 1. So we're voting to grant planning application, grant planning permission by 3 to 1. And thank you for joining us. Yes.
Chairman, sorry, yeah, you voted on the recommendation, which has fallen.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now there is the next step, which is to propose to approve.
Yeah.
And give reasons,
Yeah.
because you're going against the recommendation.
Yeah.
So it has to be proposed by someone and seconded by someone to vote to grant.
Yeah.
And just make clear what your reasons are, which presumably is that it's not going to cause harm to the conservation area, but we'll come to that. But can we first just have it proposed and seconded to grant planning permission, and then we'll just discuss the reasons.
Sorry, yes, this is we don't often get proposals to refuse, which to committee, so it's an unusual one. But thank you for that. Could someone please propose? We need to first propose to grant it.
Yes, propose to sort of, just to grant planning permission for
planning.
the turret. Yes,
yeah.
And second.
Could I have a proposer? Yeah, Councillor Lane.
Yes,
yeah.
I would like to propose.
Councillor North, would you like to second?
Yes, I beg to second.
Okay.
So we now need to vote on that.
Yes, but we normally have a little discussion on your reasons, just to, because we've picked up your reasons, but we just need to confirm them in public for the minutes.
Yes, no, I understand. So, so effectively, we are saying that we don't believe it does cause harm to the conservation area. I don't know, Mr. Taylor, if you'd like to take a stab at wording that better than I can.
Well, I think you've actually said it. I mean, I think probably the correct expression would be that it would preserve the character or appearance of the conservation area. I mean, that is sufficient to justify the grant of permission.
Assuming we're happy with that as reason, we then need to take a vote on that. So all those in favour of granting planning for that reason?
Can we just say that?
All those against? So that's three. Yes, sorry, Mr. Taylor, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was just going to wait for you just to finish that sentence.
So 3-1 in favour of granting planning.
And then I was just going to say, and then there's the question of conditions. What I would say here is that actually we've got a good set of drawings. We know what the materials would be. We know it would be clad in lead and so on. So I don't think there's a case for any sort of particular conditions apart from the standard conditions that would require them to carry out the developments in accordance with the plans. But I think just for completeness, if you would delegate the final list of conditions to officers, then we could just make sure it doesn't need anything else. But actually, I don't expect it will do.
Yep, very happy to do that. Yes, we would like to do that. Thank you. So in which case we proceed to the next case, which is Waynflete Square and Shellfleet Drive. We've been going for 2 hours. Would anyone like to take a quick 5-minute break? Very, very happy if, yeah. Let's take a quick break and we'll resume in 5 minutes. Righto, I think we'll restart. We've got three cases left. The first one is Waynflete Square and Shellfleet Drive.
Thank you. So for the Waynflete and Shellfleet proposal, essentially this is all to do with the replacement of the main entrance communal wooden double doors. The wooden doors would be replaced by steel doors to 13 different entrances. The first image just gives you the sort of architectural flavour of Waynflete Square and Shellfleet Drive. As you'd expect, all the entrances in question are situated around the ground floors of the buildings. And the top image there basically shows you the front elevation east view of Waynflete Square as existing, and then the proposed elevation is at the bottom. So you can see there actually in terms of the elevations, really not a lot's changing. Closer up, that's the existing entrance to 5 to 11 Waynflete Square, and that's a photograph of 2 to 12 Shellfleet Drive entrance, and then that's an image of the proposed entrance. So really it's just a modernisation of the existing entrances to the blocks. And then just a couple more images, that's 2 to 12 Shellfleet as existing, and then as proposed. Slight change in colour, but otherwise the elevations are pretty much the same.
Colleagues, have no speakers, so any questions? Yes, Councillor North.
Can I just ask the reason why we're looking to do this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, lots of decisions, the vast majority of applications that don't have objectors can be determined in accordance with the Council's delegated authority. The delegated authority, though, doesn't actually spell out that applications by the Council for its own properties can be dealt with under delegated powers. So until such time as that might be amended, we bring all of the Council's own applications to committee.
Was that your question, or were you
wondering?
Sorry.
I understand that reason. I mean, is it for economy? Is it security? Is it the main reason for replacing the doors?
Oh, sorry, the reason for the doors. I thought you meant... I don't honestly know, because we don't question the reason for an application as a rule. I would imagine that the timber doors have been in place for a sufficient time to warrant their replacement. I think security-wise, the steel doors would give added security. I don't think cost is really part of it.
I'll just ask a quick question raised by the sole objector, saying he's concerned that the doors, because they're outward opening, it says attempting to unlock and open them when carrying shopping, if you have mobility problems like a wheelchair, would be very difficult. Are there any concerns we've identified in that regard?
Only that actually it's been confirmed that the doors will be inward opening, so that concern.
Sorry, well that deals with that one. Okay. In which case, if there are no other questions, we'll proceed to a vote. The recommendation is to grant. All those in favour? 4 in favour, so no against, no abstentions, and we grant planning permission. Right, we then proceed to the penultimate case, 13 Gunter Grove.
Okay, this is 13 Gunter Grove. This is agenda number 48 in the South team pack. Again, there was an addendum for this item regarding particular amendments to a paragraph within the report itself. The proposal itself is for the alterations to the main roof to create a roof terrace, and at the same time the creation of a terrace on the rear outrigger roof. The property in question is a 4-storey terrace property, which you can see here outlined in red. It is not listed but lies within the Sloane Stanley Conservation Area. Also, within this image, which you can see, there are a number of existing roof terraces which have been implemented over the years following a grant of planning permission. This is set out in the report under paragraph 4.3. Just another view at the back of the site. Given the existing roof terraces, the original roof scapes, which originally comprised butterfly roofs, that aspect of the characteristic feature within the terrace has somewhat been eroded. Also, what's noted on this is the number of terraces on a closet wing in this street. Therefore, the proposed outrigger terrace would be in keeping with the prevailing character. Moving on to some plans now. These are the existing proposed first and second floor plans. The only notable change which you can figure out, which would be that third image in from the left, would be the creation of a new terraced area over the closet wing at second floor level. The properties at each end of the sites at numbers 11 and 15 Gunter Grove both also have terraces above their closet wing, and therefore overlooking would be mutual. Moving on to some roof plans existing and proposed. The roof terrace, which you can see on the right hand side, which displays the existing butterfly roof, that would be converted into a flat roof. It would also be set back from the front elevation, and an opening hatch will be created for access. Just moving on to some sections. Again, what you can see on the right-hand image of the proposed new internal stairs to be installed for access for the existing occupiers to the new roof terrace, and the outrigger terrace is shown to the right of that image with the boundary treatment as well. Again, more existing and proposed sections, but looking in the other perpendicular way, which you can see the treatment of flat roof, the hinge opening hatch from the inside. Existing elevations, what you can see from this image is you can clearly see the slopes of the butterfly roof on the existing elevations, and on the front it just sits behind the parapet. And in the proposed elevations, regrettably that V-shaped butterfly roof has been lost through the front. But at the same time, the new terrace would have some form of protection, but that would be set back from the front to reduce its prominence. However, towards the rear, that distinct shape will be retained in order to preserve somewhat the character of the terrace. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, no speakers. Colleagues, any questions? Could I just ask, could you go back to the existing front elevation again? Just be good to see that. Right, yeah. So you can see the edge of the butterfly roofs there, and then on the proposed elevation, you lose that sort of hint of butterfly roof. Yeah. I just had another question around overlooking. What's the impact of this new terrace on overlooking, and any new views?
Are you referring to the roof terrace or the terrace on the closet wing, or both?
Both.
On the roof terrace itself, you can see from the existing site, there are existing roof terraces, at least on one side of the subject site. Obviously, there will be some form of sort of boundary treatment to avoid overlooking in between properties. But further sitting behind that and 1 story down, you have a small flat roof sections to which the new closet wing terrace would be sited. What you can clearly or distinguish or make out from that image is just to the left of that, there is a neighbouring property with a larger terrace that is existing. Notwithstanding, obviously, the proposal before you is the creation of a new terrace. There will be mutual overlooking in both directions, and likewise the other property on the opposite end, although it's slightly set further away from the closet wing terrace, again there is an existing and larger terrace over the closet wing, and again there will be mutual overlooking. And considering the relationships and the existing terraces within the terrace, officers are on agreement that it shall not give rise to any significant new overlooking above and beyond the current conditions.
That's clear. Thank you very much. Yes, Councillor Lane.
I note in section 7 consultations there are comments about noise nuisance, and your response did say that it wasn't possible to condition the use of the terrace. I'm just wondering, would it be possible to add an informative or anything in this decision just as a reference to noise and nuisance and other teams in the council to let them know that this is perhaps a problem dwelling and may get worse were this to be granted?
What do you think?
Obviously, noise nuisance, there's a separate council noise pollution team to which, if there's any significant noise occurring on any particular site, not just this specific site, they can contact them even out of office numbers. I can't see why we cannot impose such an informative reminding the applicant's obligations that obviously these terraces should be used in a manner to not generate significant noise disturbance to neighbouring properties, and there are controls in place, not under the planning regime, but under the environmental health legislations that actually deals with noise complaints, and that can be dealt through the council's internal system.
I think that's probably no bad thing
Yes.
to draw attention to the applicant and also to the objectors, so just make sure that they're aware of that. Thank you. Yes, Councillor North.
Within the conservation area, is there not, I realise there's other flat roofs as well, is there not a sensitivity with retaining the original butterfly roofs, or is that not a sensitivity now, seeing that other properties are doing it?
I mean, that's a good question. What you can clearly see within this roofscape, had there not been any roof terraces within that particular terrace, obviously the butterfly roof is an important roofscape feature of that terrace. It's highly unlikely we would have supported a proposed loss of that butterfly roof to create a flat roof. So therefore, that would have been that particular stance some years back if it was largely reserved. But moving forward, we can clearly see a number, at least half a dozen of those properties have been converted into some form of roof terrace to which planning permission has been granted. And as such, in making an assessment in terms of how the development impacts on the wider conservation area, we have to take in consideration those form of developments in our decision-making process. And if we were looking to refuse the application, for example, we need to ask ourselves the question, is our reason for refusal robust in defending at appeal? Should it go to appeal? The inspector would take one look at the street, pick up that obviously the number of roof terraces within the same terrace, and therefore this proposal would be in keeping with that. So that's the view we've taken, and that's the reason why we were supporting it.
Any other questions? No. Okay. In which case, we proceed to a vote. I think it's a fairly simple application. There's not too many complexities to it. It is, to some extent, losing an original feature, though elements of the butterfly roof have been maintained, which is good to see. And we've heard Ms. Lau's summation of the existing context. So I think, in my view, on balance, it probably is acceptable. Any other comments before we proceed to a vote? No. In which case, the recommendation is to grant. All those in favour?
The informative as well?
Yes, with the informative, yeah. All those in favour? Yeah. And none against, no abstentions. So unanimously in favour, and permission is granted. Which takes us on to our final case, 23 Finstock Road.
Well, the application here seeks planning permission for a basement storey and light well alterations to the side. In short, it's a policy compliant basement and extension application. The first image that I can show you there is obviously an aerial shot, and you see the application property identified with the orange dot just there in the middle of the photograph. You can see that in common with all the properties along there's a shared light well between the two houses, and you can see the neighbouring property and how it relates to the application property. And then that's the front elevation, just to give the flavour of the house. The existing section, so you can see it's a two-storey house at the front, but it's got a third level within the roof space. And that's the proposed section. So the big change there is that the basement is now inserted underneath the house. As I said, it's a policy-compliant single-storey basement, takes up half the garden, and is mostly beneath the parent property. There's a light well at the rear that you can see there in section, which is in part of the garden. And that's the rear elevation as existing. So that's the existing side extension that you saw in the photograph at the beginning. That's the proposed rear garden. So you can see there that there's a terrace area with a light well just over to one side that provides light down to the basement level. And in plan form, that's the light well that you just saw at ground floor level. So you can see the light well provides that there'd be French doors or sliding doors down there to provide air and light to the study and to the studio. That would be at basement level. And that's the last slide, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, questions? I had one. Because the objectors raised some significant concerns about construction that's already taken place and the impact of ongoing construction. I note I think as a condition, the applicant is signing up to, or must sign up to, considerate constructors practice. Could you just remind us the protections that provides to the neighbours?
Well, I think I'd actually draw the committee's attention to the whole suite of conditions. Condition 7 requires a construction traffic management plan. And then condition 8 deals with the professional management of the engineering side of the proposals. Condition 9 requires membership of the considerate construction scheme, constructors scheme, which deals with working hours and working practices, how the site is run. And then condition 10 is quite a far-reaching condition that requires the applicants to abide by the council's own code of construction practice. When you put all of those conditions together, that really is about as far as anyone can go under the Town and Country Planning Act in terms of regulating how building works take place and mitigating impact upon neighbours.
So, just quoting from the from one of the objections from Mr. Leeks at number 21, refers to headaches from the previous construction and the dreadful smell of burning steel. So under the current conditions, what protection would he have from those things?
Well, under the current conditions in relation to those two things, he could expect a visit from one of the construction management team pursuant to condition 10.
So he has the right not to have the I suppose, I don't know if there's a scale for measuring strength of smell, but a clear smell of burning steel wouldn't be permissible under those conditions?
I think it's always going to be a matter of fact and degree. I mean, ultimately, building work will always cause some sort of disruption. I think that just has to be accepted. smells of burning steel shouldn't really be the result for a neighbour, not even within the building site. I mean, the point about the construction management team is that it's a multidisciplinary team. So although there's a planning enforcement officer within that team, the team also includes environmental health officers as well as highways officers. The matter of smell or burning smells would be dealt with by the environmental health officer. And obviously there are other controls under the Environmental Protection Act and also under the Control of Pollution Act. So the idea of that team is that they bring together all those disciplines. And I'm sure that there are controls under the Control of Pollution Act in relation to smells and burning and so forth.
Okay, that's helpful. And I mean, he also refers to loud noise taking place on Saturday mornings. And I think I'm right in saying that certainly wouldn't be permitted, and he could report that, and we would take enforcement action if that were to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know if we could minute just to contact those objectors to make them aware of the options open to them in terms of, you know, what is allowed and how they report it if that's breached.
Sorry, I'm not sure that's appropriate for a minute. What are you saying? The objector? I mean,
just to contact the objectors, make them aware of the conditions and thus the protections it gives them, and let them know the correct email address or phone number to report it in the event that those conditions are breached.
well, we don't normally do an informative to advise the objectors to do something. It's normally... Yeah.
It's us notifying the objector. I mean, we can minute that. It's an action that we can do. What we would do, though, is we'd refer them to the document on the... Because we place a decision notice on the website and we have the details of that team available online, we'll just direct them to the relevant parts of the website so they can access that information.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Now, I'm just conscious of the tough time they seem to have had already, so I just feel that might be a helpful thing to those objectors. Okay, so we'll add that to the minute, but that doesn't change the proposal at all, which, yes, I mean, as far as it goes, I think, you know, we've put all the conditions we can, as we heard from Mr. Taylor, in terms of the considerate constructor scheme and those other conditions, but broadly, as far as I can tell, it is a policy compliant basement application. Yes, Councillor North.
Just to go on from that, Mr. Peterson raises that on behalf of the Resident Association. We can assure them that it's obviously compliant and that his fears are covered. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Councillor Benton.
Yeah, thank you. Might be being dense here. Where are we on the SUDS statement that's mentioned in the first of the objections? There's a condition 12. It mentions it, but I'm not quite sure how that pertains to what we're doing here. Like, are we waiting for a recommendation or what's happening?
Well, proposed recommended condition 12 actually requires the applicant to develop a full sustainable drainage strategy and then submit that for the council's approval. I mean, that's a typical condition where we have basement proposals.
So that wouldn't come back in front of us unless we were to require it to do so. So that would say that would have to be discharged as a condition before they could start construction. So the relevant expert officer on the in the council would have to review it and give it his or her mark of approval before the condition was discharged and construction could begin.
Okay, thanks. So that's like a strong condition, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's speaks directly to Mr. Peterson's concerns, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would draw your attention, I think, to the last paragraph in the condition that actually requires them to fully implement the strategy. So as soon as the strategy is approved, then they have to actually carry out all the content of that strategy.
Thank you. That's good to know. Okay, in which case I think we should proceed to a vote. The recommendation is to grant. All those in favour? That's unanimously in favour. No, none against, no abstentions. So permission is granted for 23 Finstock Road, and that brings us to a close. Thank you all very much.